Hi everyone, this is Elias Martin of Collecting Japanese Prints. This is our second installment in our seminar series, and today's seminar is Old Roots, New Shoots, Yamamoto Kanai, Tobari Kogan, and the Early Years of Sosaku Hanga. And I think our title for our seminar today is quite appropriate. Today is the first day of spring. So, welcome, spring. It's been kind of a long winter here in Chicago. So, we're looking forward to the warmer weather, the sunshine, which today is cooperating. There's a little bit of light coming into the room where I'll be showing prints, which is great. And so I want to welcome you again. And for those of you who are new to the series or to my Woodblock Wednesday series, I'm Elias Martin. I'm the owner of CollectingJapanesePrints.com. And I like to produce videos, weekly videos on a number of topics relating to Japanese prints and paintings. And in particular, about quarterly, I produce a seminar on a particular topic that I find kind of interesting, or I feel it's a topic that is sort of overlooked, either in scholarship or in other galleries. And so, today we'll be discussing the early years of Sosaku Hanga. And that is an area I think that is overlooked in Japanese prints. It's the early part of the 20th century of a tradition that, for a lot of reasons, doesn't get its due compared to Shinhanga or even the Meiji period or ukiyo-e prints of the past. So, we'll be diving into that more specifically in just a moment. I just wanted, maybe I should, actually, I'm going to come down and sit down a little bit and first of all, just sort of discuss the beginning part of the period so that we could sort of get a proper context for these prints, and then we'll go right to the table and have a look. So this early period of Japanese printmaking is quite different than the tradition that came before it. Well, during the Edo period, we had ukiyo-e, which is a tradition that required or basically had a collaborative process in making prints. So you had the publisher hiring the artist to produce a design, and then you had the publisher hiring the woodblock carvers and woodblock print um, artisans, and they all produced the print. Now, the artisan process was, pretty intense. It took 20 years to become a full-fledged master. So technically, they were fantastic prints. When they were produced, particularly in the Edo period early, those prints were fantastic. But the artist had a sort of a limited sort of amount of say in the process. I mean, he produced the design. Clearly, it was his design, but the publisher had a bit more control. The publisher could decide, well, a certain coloration is not as popular based on what the original artist designs, and so the publisher could change the colors, or in some cases, they could change the entire season, and so there's some cases for some prints where they were originally a fall or summer scene and they became a snow scene because snow scenes were more popular. And so there was that issue. And so it was really more of a commercial enterprise, certainly ukiyo-e and in Meiji period prints. But at the end of the 1900s, during the Meiji period, there was a lot of information coming into Japan. There were, I mean, and when I mean information, I mean artistic, social, literary, all kinds of artistic information was coming in. And so just kind of imagine yourself being in a world that was sort of locked in and shuttered to the outside world for hundreds of years. And then, yes, there was slowly influences sort of trickling in over the years. But during the Meiji period, the doors and the windows, everything was wide open. And so imagine getting all of these artistic movements all at once, particularly towards the late Meiji, early Taisho period. Imagine you're getting cubism, fauvism, realism. I mean, all of these things all at once. And it was quite a daunting task to go through all that, sifting through all of those movements all at once. At the same time, it was exciting because there was no one way of doing things. And for the very first time in Japan's artistic history, artists were born. I mean, and I say this because there was no word for artist before this period. And it was artisan, but not artist. And so the individual as an artistic sort of, well, as an artistic individual was not sort of an idea that was popular. I mean, there were some artists that achieved notoriety, like Hokusai, and there was a following for him, and these eccentric artists like Jakuchu and others, so-called eccentric artists, but they had a sort of a following, and they had, there was something about them, people followed and were interested in them. Okay, that's true, but they were the exception. Most of the time, it wasn't about what you had to say. It was about the job you had to produce. And so artists didn't really have a voice. It wasn't until the early part of the 20th century when artists started traveling to Europe or to the United States, and they started seeing that artists had a voice, a very important voice. And so they started noticing, first of all, that Japanese prints were very important to the Western art movements. I think it was Manet who basically said there wouldn't be any Impressionism if Japanese prints never made it to Europe. And they were liberating because they were different and it allowed artists to think differently. And so when the Japanese visited Europe, they saw how important Japanese prints were to other artists and ones that were influential to them. So they came back to Japan and thought, well, woodblock printmaking is something that's sort of inherent in the native sort of landscape of Japan. It's something that a lot of artists said, oh no, it's our heritage, it's our birthright. But let's use this so that we could advance our artistic voice as opposed to making prints for commercial purposes. And so it was a very exciting time. They traveled around Europe, produced artwork in Europe, or came back and produced artwork influenced by the artists in Europe or in the United States. And again, it was the very first time that these artists were producing work that serviced their own voice, their own ideas. And so we start seeing these interesting designs by artists that were showing us their fears, the anxiety of the time, their hopes, their all of the things that you would think an individual, an artist would want to say. So that is sort of what we're dealing with. This period of time that we'll be discussing, and I'll be showing artwork, represents the artist's sort of navigation through all of the different artistic movements that were coming into Japan at the time. It's also reflective of their travels overseas, and it also reflects their inner workings as a human being. Their as I said, their fears, anxieties, their hopes and desires as individuals, and that's exciting. That's exciting because when we see that, when we see and engage with these designs, we're not looking at something that was created solely to sell. And in fact, in many cases, most of these prints were not produced for commercial purposes. They were produced by artists that were amateurs. in the truest sense of the word. They did it for the love of the medium and the love of producing artwork for its own sake. And that's fantastic. There aren't that many art movements throughout the world that we could dive into and look at work produced with very little concern for commercial purposes. And so that gives us an opportunity to look into sort of the psychology and the history of individuals in Japan, particularly during a time that's very exciting, very confusing, but exciting and exhilarating for individuals. And so this is why I think this seminar is important. And the other thing I think is important is because these prints were not produced in vast numbers. They're very, very rare. They're scarce. And some prints that I'll be showing you exist in one or two impressions. I don't think I'll show you something that's unique, but they're close to being unique. And so the fact that these have survived in such, I mean, they weren't produced in large numbers, and the fact that they survived despite all of the wars and all of the other things that have happened in Japan is a miracle in many ways. And so, because this artwork is not represented in mass quantity in collections, private collections, or even public collections, I think it gets overlooked. And so I'm very fortunate to have this group to show you, and this is why it's an honor, a pleasure, and I also think it's an obligation to share all of these things with all of you. So thank you again for joining me, and I hope we will all enjoy diving into a world of early 20th century Japan. All right, so that was a lot of talking. Without further ado, let's go to the table and have a look. So now I'm going to try to do something that is quite challenging, and that is discuss artwork, pull prints out of folders with one hand, and hold the phone with another. I've been doing this for a bit, so I think I can do this. And so here we are. There's my conference table, my dining room table, my table of all things, and I've laid out prints in particular folders. They're they're organized by artist and by dates. And I might bounce around a little bit because there are also some oversized prints on that side that belong to prints that are early. So we could start our conversation with this work. This is actually a magazine. And the magazine is called Myojo or Morning Star. And it was produced by artists. Mainly, the editor is Ishi Hakute. And it contains basically the very first Sosaku Hanga print produced. In 1904, this magazine was done in 1904, and this print showcases the work by Yamamoto Kanai, and he was an he apprenticed as a woodblock wood engraver, which is slightly different from a traditional woodblock print artist because they're carving into the thicker end of the wood. So if I could use my table, this side of the wood is easier to carve onto, but if you imagine the edge of it, and this is the part of the wood that's even harder to carve into, and they would carve out blocks from that part of the wood. And I mean, he was quite good at it, obviously, and created some very detailed work. And in this case, he made a print of a fisherman. He's smoking a pipe, and he's sort of overlooking the bay. And what you see here is this wonderful design that's created by basically a knife gouging out the design. Now, this is the inverse of what we normally encountered in woodblock printmaking, particularly in the Edo period. They would carve out the lines. So you would imagine to create a line, you got to carve around the line to produce the line so that that's the part that gets inked and then impressed onto the paper. Yamamoto Kanai is working opposite of that. He's carving out areas almost as if he's painting. and and he's just so it's much more spontaneous and expressive. And so I want to come in and I want you to see the swirls and the it almost looks like brush strokes across the design. It's very expressive. It's very, very expressive. And that's really one of the important characteristics of Sosaku Hanga. They have a spontaneous, emotionally charged quality to them. Now, Yamamoto Kanai is an important artist in the sense that he started the movement, and we're fortunate that he started it because he was very capable of producing woodblock print as an artist, as a carver. Um, Artists before him weren't trained as woodblock carvers. They were trained in Western style painting or watercolor or traditional Japanese style painting. But they were not woodblock carvers. But the fact that he was able to take his training and use that to advance his own artistic ideas. And so this entire book basically is a manifesto of woodblock printmaking, or what I could say is a manifesto of the artist as an individual, as an important voice in Japan. And so, this was groundbreaking, in many ways shocking. And so, and I also think that the fisherman design is an interesting choice. It's as a subject. Fishermen is heroic. They many times risk their lives for their livelihood. And so there's this sense of there's certainly a charisma to fishermen, but there's a determination and a steadfast quality in their approach to life. And I think that's analogous to what Yamamoto Kanai was saying about the artist as an individual at this time in Japan's history. So I'm going to zoom in so you could see again. Now, I'm not going to stay as long as I normally stay with artwork on my Woodblock Wednesdays because there's a lot to discuss. But so I just want to highlight the works. So again, this is an original magazine with the original woodblock that was produced and included into this magazine. Now, that was 1904. Now, this is a little later. This is 1907, and this is a postcard. Now, this is very rare. I'm including it in today's seminar because not many people know that Yamamoto Kanai, um, part of his livelihood at this period of time was producing woodblock printed postcards. He made them and they were sold, and as you could tell, they were used. And this is one of, I believe, three surviving impressions. There's one at the MFA in Boston from the very important Lauder collection of postcards. That one I don't think was ever shipped or mailed, I mean. But here you could tell this was mailed. There's the stamp from showing from the back, and I'll show that in a moment. But what I want to show is how beautiful this this postcard is and the detail that went into carving this. This is quite astonishing. And you might ask yourself, why would Yamamoto create a postcard with such effort and such work? You could see the detail in the fishermen's, kimonos and their robes, and they're very detailed because these fishermen robes are quite thick, and you could see the ties, and then also the material that's used to produce them. They're quite thick, and so he was able to get in there and carve that detail. The reason why he did that was this was a way to promote or advance Sosaku Hanga. This was a way of saying, hey, this is what we're doing as artists, and he was selling these postcards. They were being mailed out, and this is actually basically a little note from someone, and who sent this postcard, and there's some additional writing on the edge. But this is in some ways an advertisement or a promotional leaflet, if you'd like, about the movement. Now, there's no text from him. He's not indicating anything, but this was different from what was being produced previous, and it's very much in line with the mission of Sosaku Hanga. And I must say that the movement, it was an uphill climb because it was not in line with the idea of fine art. It was not, at least in Japan at the time, it was not in line with even the idea of what art was. And the idea of the artist as an individual was something that was still coalescing. And so this was an interesting work. And I just wanted to point that out because it's so rare. And so, I'd share it. It's a pleasure to share it with all of you. All right. So that is the first folder. Let's see if I can, yeah, seems to be doing okay. Okay, so this is before we get to this print, Yamamoto Kanai decided that he needed to go to Europe. He was certainly interested in European art that was coming into Japan, and so he created a subscription among his followers. And I think also the postcards were a way to get that following. And so he had a group of people interested in purchasing a subscription, which basically paid his way to go to Europe. And so in 1912, he went off to Europe, and but before arriving in Europe, he on this boat stopped in Shanghai and stopped in various places in Asia going up to Europe, and he produced this print on his travel. Note the smaller format. This is handmade Japanese paper that he took with him to Europe. And so his very first prints are small because, I mean, I think he was very concerned about keeping his materials and having enough to produce, enough artwork to produce so that he can fulfill his obligations and pay his bills. So his very first prints aren't very large, and then the ones that were done a little bit later become bigger and bigger. And I suspect because he realizes he has enough paper. And so this is a design of a woman, and that's her hair. She has a pigtail, and she's sort of standing right at the edge of the boat, and the sunlight is hitting the water in such a way that is reflecting the waves onto the design. And this has such an expressive quality to it. It's fantastic. It's one of the first prints produced of its kind in this way. And note that there is very little lines that create the design. And traditionally, in Edo period and even Meiji period prints, the first printing was the key block. In many ways, that was the most important block because it was like sort of the first page, a page out of a coloring book. And then all the subsequent printings had to keep their orders and make sure that the color was within the lines. And so in this case, that was thrown out. It's sort of revolutionary, and he is printing a print with color on top of color, creating a really spontaneous and emotionally charged design. So I'm going to come in closer to the print, and you could see what I mean. Now, if just to say that this is rare is understatement. There might be 10 of those in existence in the world, and particularly most of them are in museums. And that was done in 1912. This was also done in 1912, and this shows three Chinese women. They're prostitutes. There's different names for this print. It's some references call it wild chickens, which is I mean, I won't go into all the alliterations and original Japanese that was used to describe the scene, but it basically three Chinese prostitutes that are sitting in a room, And again, what you see here, no significant black outlines here. It's an image that is almost done in a watercolor-like effect, very quick, very spontaneous in the applications of color in the background, and it has kind of like a grittiness to it that reminds me of Toulouse-Lautrec. It has that quality to it. And the print is actually kind of small. You'll see this is the edge of the paper, and it's mounted onto a larger mat folder. And if I can open this, oh, it's done in the Japanese way. You'll see and this is actually Western paper. This is French. He acquired this in Europe and then mounted the prints when he acquired this and then shipped it out back to Japan. And you'll notice this is pretty cool. There is a signature here. That's his signature, and there's a number 3, which may make a reference to this is the third print that he produced in the series. I'm not quite sure what the number 3 is, but I think that's probably what it is, considering the date is 1912, and it does follow chronologically his designs from his movement from Japan to Europe. But again, this is an extraordinarily rare print. It's very, very cool, and so I'm going to come in and show you the impression again. Now, this is quite the departure from the bijinga produce of courtesans by other artists of the ukiyo-e period. Very, very different. And I think that's intentional. All right, so we got now we get to 1913, and he was hitting a stride. So he ended up in northern France, so Normandy, and he produced some designs here. I'm going to pull a few out because, well, at once, because they're the same size. Thanks for bearing with me about pulling all these things. I don't have that much space. None of these are framed. Otherwise, we could just walk around in space and talk about artwork. So all of these are in folders. So the first two I'll discuss is these are bathers that are out in a nice, beautiful pool of water by the sea, and and so it's a typical design that you would find. Actually, it's a design that you would find in painting around this area and throughout Europe. It is a very typical sort of genre design of bathers. But it's interesting because again, no key block outline, no black outline. These are colors printed on colors in a loose, sort of expressive way. And it also, you start seeing simplification of forms here. So this form of this nude bathing, it's not necessarily accurate. And at this time in Japan, there was an obsession for accuracy and representing the human form, at least in painting, with a serious realism. And so this sort of rejects that idea. It's more about the feelings associated with the scene. But you obviously you could see that these are figures, and it's not abstract per se, but it is a simplification of the forms in this print. So I'm going to zoom in so you could see the printing here. As I said, it's very expressive. It there are no key block outlines. The colors are printed on top of each other, and so it is a really interesting design that really shows the movement's sort of project. And it's not about realism, it's about the artist's emotional response to what he's seeing or what he is doing. So the next print is also, this is a Bay and Brittany. Both of these were done in 1914, all three. So we'll talk about all three of them. They're done in 1914. He's doing these in Europe. Most likely, he produced these impressions in his Parisian apartment, but these are designs based on sketches that he made out in the field. And this is a very charming cow design. You see these figures on the boats, and I think that's really cool how it's so Japanese to cut this off right there, and then here just seeing the top of the sail. This might remind you of work by Degas or by Manet or even Monet for a lot of reasons. The composition, as I said, how things are cut off, that is something that the Impressionists utilized quite a bit. Degas did that. He cut people off. He would center the compositions in really interesting ways to create sort of emotional effects. And there's a particular one I'm thinking of that's in Chicago, but the point is, the composition, the way that it's oriented, situated in things that are cut off is very Japanese, but also the texture and the this sort of this pattern, and not just in the grass, but actually throughout the way that it's printed. It's in a soft sort of texture, which is similar to this print. That's expressive. That is showing the hand of the artist at work when he's printing the works. So this is not this is not like a hasui. So for all of you who are familiar with Shinhanga, and just imagine Hasui's prints. There's Hasui started working right before the earthquake in the early 20s. This is a few years before Hasui. This does not look anything like a Hasui print. The format is small. The printing is soft and very spontaneous. It's not even, and it's more emotionally charged. And these two kind of have an effect. When I look at them, they feel kind of nostalgic. They have the effect of almost if the artist looking back, almost daydreaming about these scenes, and they're printed like that. So I mean, that's just my interpretation, of course, but they do have that effect, which are very different from Shinhanga prints and other work that was being produced in Japan at the time by the other movement of printmaking. So I just thought it'd be nice to compare the two. Now, the third work produced in 1913. This is a wood engraving. So it is not a woodblock printed print like this. They're produced by wood, but he's using the end of the wood. So again, I see a few of you have just joined me. This is the surface of a plank of wood. I'm using my table as an example. This is where you would normally carve the design. But he used, in this case, because he's a wood engraver, he was trained as a wood engraver, he's able to use the edge of the wood, which is much denser, and he he cuts a piece of wood from that end, and he's able to carve very intricate designs. This almost has the effect of an etching. It really is astonishing the quality that he could produce. How intricate. And so I'm going to zoom in even more. You see all those lines; those are all carved. Those are all carved. This type of style, as I said, is more in line with etchings, copper plate etchings. And he did experiment with copper plate etching and other things, and we could get to that later. But the point is, in this design, this is all carved. I'm just going to come in and very close and zoom in so you could see the detail. This is also a scene in Normandy. Now, to give you a sense of scale, this print is smaller than these small size prints, and so to give you a sense, I should have brought out a Shinhanga print, but two of these roughly make the size of one print, and so they're Chuban size, and this is even smaller. And the detail in here is amazing. So I thought it's great to show all three because you could do both things. very, very well. And he did these two designs in this way to advance his artistic ideas. It's not because he couldn't produce something more realistic, because he does in this case. So I think that's kind of neat. All right, so let's move right along. At the end of our seminar, I will have time for questions. So for all of you who soldier through the entire presentation, if you have questions, I'd be happy to take them. All right, next work is also from 1913. This is a larger work. This is a design known by the title Saint Martin. And it's a pretty cool design, partly because, well, I like it because my last name is Martin. And of course, so maybe I'm named after this field, who knows? But this is a field in Normandy, and it's the first state. It's a very early impression. For those of you who know this design, there's usually up here it says Saint Martin in carved out in the woodblock matrix. And this impression was done before he added the title. So that's kind of cool for collectors and connoisseurs that who always seek out the earliest impressions. This is certainly one of them. The other thing is this is mounted onto the same type of paper that was on the three prostitutes. And so here we have his signature in Western style in ink on this European French paper mount. And so this is an idyllic scene. He probably has seen so many paintings done of pastoral scenes like this. And so, of course, he produced one too. But in this case, it's wood. It's a printed with the woodblock print process, and you'll see that again, all of this is very fresh. It's seen with new eyes, the eyes of a Japanese, that an artist that is interested in exploring the expressive qualities of woodblock printmaking. And so we have this beautiful soft printing of blue that becomes gray, and there's these clouds overhead, and it's done here. I'm going to zoom in so you could see. This is done directly onto the block. He applies the pigment and then just impresses it, and you see this. This is for these sort of relics from the impression. This pigment just that is just moving down, that is, that anticipates the messiness of Onchi. This is done 1913. Onchi wasn't doing this until the 20s, late 20s. So there's this expressive quality in this print. And of course, in here, you have color on top of color. You don't have a key block outline, though there is kind of a grayish outline that creates sort of the buildings. It's the color that's printed over it in a loose way that actually gives the design some charm. So, again, very much in line with his work. I'm going to zoom in so you can see. I have never seen this design without the signature. And as far as I know, I mean, this might be unique in terms of impression. And in terms of how many of this design I've seen in the wild, this is the only one. Most of them are in museums, and I think of three impressions. That's how rare these prints are. And, I'll keep pointing that out because I get questions from collectors. Oh, would you be able to find me this? And maybe, but it requires patience because it would maybe take another 10 years for me to locate another copy. So this is also a very similar scene to what we've seen. And this style is actually kind of an interesting style. It's sort of a blend of s things that I see in ukiyo-e, but at the same time blended it in with his style. and then also the European um, ideas that he's picking up at the time. So this is done in 1913 at the same time as the other design. But in this impression, we get flatter areas of color. You know, these larger planes of just green and like a lighter green or gray, and then a tan, kind of orangey red colors. And what's interesting is that this sky here, the way that with the bokashi or the gradation of dark to light, that kind of reminds me of Hokusai. And there's some elements in here that have sort of a ukiyo-e kind of inspired quality, but at the same time, there's this sort of quick, spontaneous effect also. These lines that built up the composition of the village, they're quick. You see this kind of quick line there, and most of them aren't finished. So you see this kind of like shading there, um, and so there's a little bit of there, and then of that dark black, and then the gray there. It's meant to be done almost as a quick rendering, which is pretty cool, and very different from his other prints. And so what we're doing today is really showcasing the variety of styles and techniques he mastered over the years. And again, all of this was produced while he was in Europe. It's astonishing. Oh, I'll come in and zoom in so you could see. And I'll just say that it's astonishing that these prints survive. They again were shipped directly from Europe to his subscribers. I think they were shipped in one bundle to one of his friends. It might have been Ishi Hakute, the editor of that magazine that we saw at the very beginning, and then he probably distributed them accordingly. But can you just imagine, how long that would have taken to even just mail these in the post? I mean, you know, that's kind of astonishing, and at the same time, very, very cool that they survived. Imagine if that package never made it to Japan. I mean, it could have happened. So, and all of these things would have been lost. Now, this work here represents a design that is actually native to Japan. It's a Japanese design, and this work was done in 1918. So he had returned to Japan and was producing artwork in earnest. He had a day job. He did carve out designs for books and other things like that. So this print was done in 1918. He didn't produce that many Japanese designs in his body of work. Quite frankly, he produced, if I'm correct, he produced more European designs than Japanese designs. And so this is one of them. And this is a great work. The composition is fantastic. The eye, it moves directly to the center where this figure is under the waterfall. But you can see this composition is done with these wonderful swirls, and again, it looks like a painting, and this is all carved on wood, and it's done with these spontaneous, quick carving techniques throughout the design. And you could see, I mean, that really gives you a sense of movement. But most importantly, I'd say, of course, the technique is brilliant. But most importantly, it shows emotion. It's an expressive quality of the artist. We see in these sort of gouges of the block, we see the artist's hand at work. So it's not polished. It's not, again, like a Hasui or Hiroshi Yoshida print, where everything is perfect and everything is in line, and it creates an idyllic scene that's very representative of realism. This is realistic, but it also owes a lot of its influence to German expressionism. You could see that strongly in this design. All right, I gotta start moving a little faster. There's a lot to show all of you. Now, the last work I'll show you is a painting. This was done in 1918. This was probably done in Japan when he returned, and it's interesting because it's a painting on on this is oil on canvas, and I had it mounted onto another larger canvas so I could actually show it to you. But the point is, this is a work done directly inspired by the Europeans. I see a lot of European art here. And the coloration reminds me of some Gauguin designs, who, by the way, was very interested in that part of France. He did a lot of paintings of Brittany, and so I don't know if he came across him, but at the end of the day, the coloration really reveals the influences that he acquired in Europe. And so, I'll zoom in and you could see. And then here we have his signature, and this signature matches up directly with the hand signed signature that was on the lower left of the design of the three prostitutes. So that's very cool to have two pieces signed in the same way. All right, let's move right along. Lot to see today. All right. Now, today's conversation is the early period of Sosaku Hanga. And so, one of the artists, in addition to Yamamoto Kanai, that I think left a important legacy is Tobari Kogan. And you know what? I'll open up this print and I'll give you a background on Tobari Kogan while you're looking at the print. So this is a print from 1913. Now, a little bit about Tobari Kogan. He was a artist who was interested in woodblock printmaking as well as sculpture. He produced some plaster and bronze sculptures in Japan that you could visit several museums and see his sculptures as well as his prints, of course. But he was a multifaceted artist. Like a lot of these at this period of time, they were really true artists in the Western sense. They were interested in honing their artistic skills as well as broadening their artistic ideas. So, like Yamamoto Kanai, whose work we just saw, Tabari Kogan traveled. And what's interesting is he actually ended up in New York, which I find rather interesting because most of these artists only travel to Europe at this time. And he ended up in New York and definitely engaged the artistic community in New York head on. But without going into too many more details, his travels did take him to Europe, and he returned. And this work was done in Japan in 1913. And I think his encounter with New York and Europe, but particularly New York, engaged him in an interest in modernization, skyscrapers, and imagine New York at that time in the 1900s, as these things are being built, and just imagine the metal bridges and everything else he was encountering. Well, when he returned to Japan, he started seeing the same thing. And so this design is quite striking because at first blush we see this traditional wooden bridge. This could be Nihonbashi. This is a traditional Japanese style bridge from the Edo period. And you could see the planks of wood. They're old. You could almost hear the sound of the horse carriage as it's crossing above with the figures and umbrellas. So of course it's rainy and so it's gloomy and it's gray. What's interesting here though is at the horizon, what is sort of dawning on this design is a steel bridge, and then we have here a smokestack that is actually active. And so, what in this design, I think what the artist is showing is that there's two worlds, and in some ways they're colliding, and one is very much rising at the horizon. And so modernization came fast and quick. I mean, fast and furious. It was really in a blink of an eye, Tokyo was changing, and Tabari Kogan was very acutely aware of that, and he wanted to sort of show that. And in this print, there's these two worlds that coexist, and they don't seem at odds with each other in the composition. partly because the artist does such a great job at combining both of them. But you could kind of see how this bridge does not look very stable, and it almost makes me nervous to see these people walking across with the horses and the carriage. He shows the very narrow ends of the bridge that are supporting the bridge, and it doesn't give you a sense of stability. Where this gray wash has this very strong, maybe almost ominous presence with the smokestack in the background. So there's a lot going on in this design, and I think it's charming in its own way, but also I think it's one of the most important scenes that depict Japan's rise in modernism. And so, I'm going to zoom in so you could see. This print is incredibly rare. It's also printed on a terrible paper, quite frankly. A lot of these prints in the Sosaku Hanga movement were not printed with great paper. And I could get into that in future talks too, particularly pre and post war Sosaku Hanga. But in this case, this paper is not very good, and in this case, the paper has kind of lost its sizing over the years, and it's become quite soft. And so, when artists are producing work for themselves, sometimes they didn't have access to the best material, and so, this is why a lot of these don't survive. And in this case, I've only seen this print maybe 6 or 7 times in 20 years. It's very, very rare, and I think partly because of the materials used caused a lot of them to sort of disintegrate, and we lost several just to time. All right, we'll move on. Yeah, actually, for those of you wondering, all of these prints are in archival paper, and that's basically how one should store prints. So all of these are acid-free sheets of paper. And I like to get paper that has kind of a texture so that the prints inside the folder don't move around. Now, I'm going to lay these out. These were all done by Tobari Kogan, and they're done circa 1913, 1914, and they show, two of them show circus designs, and one of them shows a beautiful scene of a woman. But we'll start with the circus designs. Yeah, so Tabari Kogan, no doubt, was exposed to the circus in Europe as well as in Japan. There was a traveling circus. Foreign circuses made their way through Japan quite often, and they were a huge attraction. And I'm sure he encountered the artwork of Picasso, Degas, and other artists that were fascinated by the circus. And so he depicted these tightrope walkers here, and this is a sort of a juggler balancing on a box, and they're holding on to this string of lanterns. Um, this person's back is arched backwards. It's done in such a quick, kind of almost wash of gray. You don't see the face, you just kind of see the hair. It's very expressive. It also reminds me again of Toulouse-Lautrec, very quick, black, kind of gritty quality in the printing. And then this composition is so great. The top person has been cut off by the design, and the focus is sure the stress that this figure is feeling to hold the weight of the person above them, and yet balance on this really small, narrow, balancing string, rope. And so, it's pretty interesting. These two, they're very much what you would imagine a European artist producing when the circus came to town. And this last work is of the same size, done at the same time, about 1912, 1914, and it is done in a way, it's a woodblock, but it's done in a way that almost is rendered as a drawing. And, I want to come in and zoom in. I want to show you something that's pretty neat. There's embossing in the woman's obi, and it's of a floral design. I don't know if you could see that. And then, of course, the neck area of the collar of the kimono is also embossed with another design. So the artist deliberately created a design that has like a quick sketch quality. But to get this in a woodblock printed form is actually quite hard. All of these lines, everything is applied on the paper with a wood block. So it has to be carved in such a way that creates that spontaneous quality, as well as the printing of the color. So all of this, the hair, those lines that look like just like a quick sketch are quite deliberate and thought through as a design. So this is quite hard to do. And of course, he adds the embellishments of woodblock printmaking with the, the the floral pattern and the OB or in the collar. So that's really neat. And again, these two designs are what you would expect a European artist to produce of the circus. So I'll zoom in so you can look at these one last time. Looking at these prints, particularly these two, and I'll show a larger one in just a moment, it's important to just understand that these Japanese artists are picking up the influence of European artists quite well, quite quickly, and incorporating them into their artwork, which is great. It's wonderful to always connect the dots and see where the winds of influence carry. The Japanese were quite influenced, or the Japanese influenced the Europeans quite a bit with their own prints from the Edo period. And it's fascinating to see how the winds of influence carry that back to Japan. So before we go to another design that is smaller, I want to show another sort of circus design by Tobari Kogan. And so this is done about 1914. And first of all, point out how big this sheet is. This is almost two Oban size prints put together. And it depicts these acrobats on balls. And it's interesting that this one ball has a American flag motif. And so this has a strong Toulouse-Lautrec quality to it. At least that's how I read it. But also, there's a strong influence by French posters of the time. The format being so large, this is, as far as I can think, I can't think of another Sosaku Hanga print that was done in this size by another artist. I think Tobari Kogan was the first artist to produce these large scale prints. And he did several, and so I am fortunate to have two today to show you. Here, I'll move this over a little bit. So I could pull both of them out. So here's another one. And both designs have a strong influence, as I said, from French posters. And that influence came into Japan actually during the Meiji period. There were a lot of Japanese artists producing posters during the Meiji period and early 20th century. And a lot of those posters had strong influences from the French. And so these large scale prints, I think, owe a lot to that. They almost read poster like, particularly when you think about what was happening at the time before. Edo period prints, by and large, were oban size, unless you put them together and there were triptychs. But they all neatly fit in an album size format, and these did not. And the other thing I think why he was producing this is that this is connecting Sosaku Hanga to sort of a greater conversation of art. A something that is perhaps miniature or something that is oban in size might reflect the older way of looking at prints. But these larger scale prints are works produced by artists, and so it wasn't, you couldn't just put this in a folder. that easily. You had to engage with this work differently than you would an Oban size print. And so I think also the scale of these prints really connect to the greater conversation of what is happening to printmaking as a work of art, as opposed to just a means of reproducing an image for commercial purposes. This was, something more, something special. And these two designs, are very important uh, because of the scale, but also because of the design. They're very striking. The composition of this particular design is very fresh, and I can see the work of a lot of European impressionists. And the irony, and I keep saying this, is that they were influenced directly by the Japanese and the asymmetrical compositions that the Japanese produced in, say, Hiroshige prints were the direct influence that these impressionists were referencing, and so now that influence comes full circle back, and we see it in this composition. All right, I'm going to zoom in so you could see. This design, by the way, is called hemp leaf pattern kimono, and you could see the hemp leaf pattern in their kimono, and in the background there, these stars are hemp leaf motifs. And this is done in such a soft printing around the face. This reads like a French poster to my eye, and it's astonishing that all of these effects, again, are achieved simply with a woodblock print. You can see around the eyes, their realism there is astonishing. All right. So these were my larger scale prints tucked in this folder. And again, these are 1914. They're very, very early works. All right, let's see. Do I have one last? Oh yeah. So this is about circa 1916, 1920. And this shows a skyscraper in Asakusa. And this skyscraper actually did not survive the earthquake, I believe. It suffered damage, and I think it was destroyed, or they demolished it. But the point is, it's interesting because this is one of the first designs by a Japanese printmaker that is focused on modern architecture as it is occurring in their natural environment. They're not daydreaming about past days in Europe producing designs of cathedrals. This artist is directly engaging in his environment and showing a very modern looking building. And so it's fascinating to see that, and it's also an important document because this print was destroyed in the earthquake. And so yeah, so I wanted to show you this because it rounds out Tobari Kogan's sort of body of work. He was influenced and was actively engaged by a lot of things. And it's interesting to see, we saw those two prints, particularly the one of the woman, and how different that is from this design, or even the acrobats. It's very different. And so the artist was certainly interested in a variety of different things and showing those things in his work. So I'll zoom in so you can see. It's signed there by the artist. There's also an embossing there. I think it's interesting to consider this print with the bridge print we started with Tabari Kogan. That is sort of the dawn of modernism in architecture. The steel structure of the bridge, and then now we're seeing these skyscrapers. This one I don't know how high it was, but certainly it was one of the tallest buildings in Tokyo at the time. And so, to see those things as they're happening for the artists is, it's always rewarding. All right, so let's move on. Oh, okay, we'll start with this. One of the other artists I want to talk about is Minami Kunzo. Minami Kunzo is known in Japan as a painter. Most of his body work is painting, but he did produce a few prints in his life. And as a printmaker, he's often overlooked because, I mean, he is such a famous oil painter, but he was very influential in this early period of Sosaku Hanga, and so that's why I wanted to include him in our conversation. And I guess I started off with, I put the painting on top first because I thought it'd be a good way of showing his style. Though he had many styles, and this is a typical sort of style he did. I would date this painting to about the 20s, like 21, 22. And just to give you a sense, there is a painting at the Museum of Modern Art Tokyo on permanent display. That's a national cultural treasure. And it's one of those that's preserved with this special title of important cultural artifact. And it's of these figures, these fishermen on a boat, and it's huge. It's a life-size painting. I mean, it is monumental. And that is in that design or in that painting, he expresses a really wonderful sense of realism. And in this case, we see the artist less concerned with realism and more about the kind of a play with color and composition. So I think Minami is sort of working with some ideas that he's taken from Cezanne in many cases. And so the composition where these fruits are sitting or where they're situated in the composition and how color informs the composition. And I get a sense of movement based on the color as well as the composition of this cloth that seems to be flowing. You kind of almost have a sense that they're rolling off this table. And so, anyway, I thought I'd start off with this painting. Of course, the painting is on wood panel. That's very typical of his paintings. And this is a typical size. You see this size over and over again at the time. Yamamoto Kanai painted works on this type of panel painting or panel for paintings as well. So yeah, it's one of those things that you just encounter, but I wanted to show all of you because his paintings, as diverse they are, and as well as they've been produced and how beautiful they are, they're very different from his woodblock prints. So Minami also traveled to Europe, and here this is a castle sort of in ruins, and this is I think the title of this is Saint Francis de Assisi. So this might be either a cathedral or castle in this area, and it's interesting because I think it is very much indicative of the early part of Sosaku Hanga. There is no serious black outline. This composition is created by color and color on top of color in a very loose sort of way. And his coloration is really interesting. They're almost pastel-like pigments that are used in the creation of his prints. And I'll point out that one of the more important things that Minami did as a printmaker is influence quite a few artists, particularly Hiratsuka. And Hiratsuka is one of the towering figures of Sosaku Hanga. He went on to teach dozens of very important Sosaku Hanga artists. But Hiratsuka mentioned that he was walking in the Ginza, I think, and then he saw out the window of one of the department stores prints by Minami. And Minami started his career as a printmaker and then moved into paintings. He did some watercolors and some paintings too, but he wanted to be a printmaker and then thought, no, I'm going to go to painting. but he had a small exhibition um, in Tokyo, and Hiratsuka walked by and saw it, and he was just spellbound. And he said, "What is this?" And he learned about printmaking, and he went on again to be one of the most influential print artists of his time. Certainly, he left us I mean, huge amount of prints, um, but his influence is as important as a teacher. He taught Azechi, he taught Masao Maeda, Oki Hashimoto. I mean, I could go on and on and on. So let me put this print to the side and pull out another one so that you could see the coloration. Minami Kunzo's prints are actually quite scarce as well. I'll keep saying this throughout the presentation because all of these prints are rare. Because as I said, they weren't produced in large quantities because the commercial environment didn't warrant it. These weren't selling. These were produced more and less for the artist's own sake and for art's sake, really. And yes, they were sold, but not enough were made to really get them out everywhere. So you see, both of them are signed in pencil, which is important because this is showcasing the artist as an individual, as an artist is taking credit for the entire work that they produced. Unlike Hasui or Yoshida, though Yoshida is a different case. We could talk about that another day. But these were hired by a publisher. And for Hasui, that publisher was Watanabe. And it's interesting, and some Hasuis you see a pencil signature at the bottom. Usually those are post-war designs or post-war impressions of earlier designs, and they were added by the shop, attendant. So a Westerner might have come into Watanabe's shop, bought a print, and they would sign it right before they would sell it to them, because Westerners are used to seeing signatures. But for Hasui, he never signed them in pencil, and Minami signed his prints. I think by and large all of his prints are signed in pencil because, again, it was important for the artist to take credit, complete credit for the creation of their artwork, because they did everything. They conceived of the design, carved the blocks, and printed the prints. And in this design, you can see how expressive it is and how the colors are applied. And going back to the earlier work here. Very expressive. All right. I think we're moving on to the last folder. Wow, okay. Thanks for bearing with me in this conversation. Um, a lot here, we're at the home stretch. So I would be remiss if I didn't speak about Onchi and the early period of Sosaku Hanga, and what he left, the influence of the early period prints. I'm going to pull another folder out too. So Onchi is arguably the most important Sosaku Hanga artist, and I would argue that he's the most important 20th century print artist, period. Uh, above above other printmakers such as Yoshida, Goyo, Hasui, and so on. I mean, and we could get into a larger conversation about why that is another time. But I will say that Onchi left such a legacy of printmaking, and influenced quite a few artists, um, that I've given lectures on Onchi, and I talk about Onchi quite a bit in other previous. I mean, my other previous seminar was centered on Onchi and his circle, so I won't go into Onchi's work too much. So if you're interested, I would encourage you to check out my last seminar on Onchi's circle of artists. But what I do want to say is I want to showcase the early period of work produced by Onchi and his friends and his artistic circle at this time because it is connecting the dots. And so Onchi never traveled outside of Japan. Well, well, it's hard. I should say he did go to Manchuria, and so that isn't really Japan, though it was kind of Japan at the time. But the point is, he never traveled to Europe, and so he didn't directly experience foreign artists' work. In the same way as Minami or Yamamoto or Kogan, Tobari. So that's interesting. But on the whole, Onchi's work is still quite open to these influences. And so Onchi learned German when he was young because his father wanted him to become a doctor, and that was the language you had to learn in preparation for a medical degree in Japan. And that allowed him to read German art magazines, and a lot of the German expressionist printmakers were producing fantastic work that came into Japan. And so, Onji was influenced by that. He loved reading about it. And this print was done in 1914. And I should say that I wish I had an earlier work that he produced too. Actually, the work that I'm thinking of was done in 1915, and Onchi is credited to producing the very first work of abstraction in Japan, period, in 1915. That's astonishing. I mean, that's as early as anyone else in the United States, and maybe 10, 15 years behind Europe. So for an artist to produce a work of abstraction in 1915 in his youth is quite astonishing and very noteworthy. And so in this work from 1914, we could kind of anticipate his interest in abstraction. This is a sort of a figure laying on down, but it's also at the same time could be read as a mountain landscape. And then there's this sort of valley at the bottom. And this work was produced for his Sukuhaya magazine. Onchi produced a art magazine with poetry and woodblock prints with two other artists that were in art school with him, Tanaka Kyokichi and Fujimori Shizu. So those three artists produced some amazing prints, and I pulled out a few. So this is Onchi's work, and these three are by Tanaka. And I should say that they're all done in 1914. And that year is very important because Tanaka died in 1915. So, or at the end of 1914. And so the point is, Tanaka was young, was in art school, but he was dealing with the end of his life. He was dying of TB, and these prints all illustrate his he's mentally and emotionally trying to come to terms with his death, and they're full of melancholy. They're full of despair, but also hope. And so in this design, we have a figure. This is her hair. I'm assuming it's a woman, but it's a figure with long hair, and there is this river of red, almost like blood. And this is the figure's arm. And so it's almost abstracted. It's very lyrical. Um, it, it reminds me of Edward Munch and his work, and he was a great influence to Tanaka, Onchi, and Fujimori. And so, I just want to point out some of Tanaka's most important designs. So this is one. This is another. There's a figure here. I'll zoom in a little bit, and this figure is holding this flower that's blooming, and it seems to be coming out of the figure's heart. And this is, I don't think this is the sun. In fact, it may be the moon because it's not really illuminated. What we have here are shadows. And of course, this may be a reference to the actual name of the magazine, meaning moon glow, Sukuhai. And so, that might, the artist might be connecting that as well. But he's showing sort of a positive, hopeful scene here, where this one seems a bit more emotionally wrought and depths of despair kind of thing. And here there's maybe some hope, a flower emerging from the heart of the artist, um, all the while the shadows around him grow. It's quite striking. And of course, this last work was done, as I said, as the artist is preparing to die, and we have a figure that is elongated and being pulled possibly up. See, it's not really clear. There are these things that are very organic that seem to maybe be holding the figure down, but at the same time, these plumes of smoke, if I can call them smoke, are lifting the figure. So there's this sort of this sense. The blue color also, I think, connects to a metaphysical, spiritual quality to it. And so it's this. I think the artist is trying to figure out: am I going up or down? What is happening to me? And so, it's very striking, very emotionally raw to know that all of these three designs were produced by an artist at the end of his life. He died so young. And so, yeah, I'm going to put these away. I'm going to pull out. I think I have a Fujimori in here, so I could show you another artist that was producing artwork. Or maybe not, or maybe did I put it somewhere else? Oh, I thought I may have pulled a Fujimori, but I didn't. So, well, I'll just focus on Onchi to end our conversation. So this is, of course, a print Onchi produced in 1914 for that magazine, and this is a work. It's called A Face, and this was done about 1915 or 1916. And the next work, we can show them side by side. This is about around the same time, 1915, 1919. These are early self-printed works. The artist is producing artwork where he's experimenting here with shadow. He was really influenced, as I said, by Munch and other German expressionists. And this design also anticipates or showcases Onchi's interest in the eye. He made many designs throughout his life that had an eye in the composition, and so this eye here is something that you see again over and over again in other things. And then these I don't know what to call them. They might be figures, and this head might be in a field of other figures, or this might be just abstracted circle blobs that are sort of free floating around the composition. It's not known. But what I could tell you is that this print, particularly in person, reveals this introspective, darker, mysterious sort of quality to it. It is quite charged, and though it's small, it really showcases Onchi's ability to be thought provoking as well as emotionally um, potent. I mean, this design brings you in. It draws the viewer in, and for it to be so small, it's quite impactful. So it's quite rare. I mean, I think I've known three impressions of this design, and one, by the way, happens to be on the cover of that book, and we could discuss the book in just a moment. And this is a print of two bathers, and this is done maybe about 5 to 8 years after Yamamoto Kanai's bathers in Brittany. And if we could think back to, I don't know if I could pull the print out again. I might not be. If oh yes, I think I could pull it out with one hand. We'll see. Okay, so oops, that's Gotta be careful with these. So we have here Onchi's bathers, and then we have Yamamoto's bathers, and we could kind of see a connection. The as I mentioned earlier in our conversation, the figure is rendered in a less than accurate way, and it's about the simplification of forms and just expressing the just the inherent emotional quality of the moment. There's kind of an endearing softness to it. And so I think that softness would disappear if it was more detailed, quite frankly. And I think Onchi picked up on that. And these two figures are, again, they're almost abstract, but they're not. You can make them out. Certainly, Onchi was capable of producing very abstracted forms at the time. So these figures are intentional in the sense that you can read them as two figures, and they're bathers, and they have a connection, I believe, to this print. This print, Onchi was aware of Yamamoto Kanai. In fact, Yamamoto inspired all of these Sosaku Hanga artists to sort of take arms, if you will, and produce artwork for themselves, and artwork that satisfied their own artistic inquiries into life. And so this design connects us to that. And then, of course, when I zoom in, you'll see how beautiful the colors are and how rich and how they're printed right over it. It's just fantastic. All right, let's see if I can pull out the last work. Gotta be careful dealing with little smaller sheets of paper that are actually quite fragile. Gotta make sure they don't blow away. All right. Okay, that's the folder for those prints. Okay, so the last work, I wanted to take us up to the earthquake. And so I could have showed a lot more artists, but I wanted to focus on the key artists of the movement. And I mean, there were others too, so don't get me wrong, and I could certainly produce another video about the other artists working at this time up for the earthquake. But the last work I'll discuss was done in 1924. And so this print is by Onchi, and the print demonstrates a really interesting sort of fascination with primitivism and maybe even Picasso. He may have experienced primitivism through Picasso because this face really has a strong sort of connection to Picasso's work. Of like 10 years before this, or even Picasso was working in this form even up until this time, I believe. So it's fascinating to see. And, Onchi was a constant experimenter, and he experimented with styles, with composition, with all kinds of things, even materials. And in my previous video, we see him printing with leaves and found objects. And so, of course, watch that video if you're interested in learning more about Onchi. But I just wanted to show this work and show sort of his artistic spirit and how open he was at embracing different styles. And this is a good. Also, I could show here a poster that was produced after this design for an exhibition in 1924. And a work like this is quite rare. It's amazing that it survived. It's a work of ephemera, so it was used to promote an exhibition. But I wanted to end our conversation with this print because this conversation, if for nothing else, should sort of help all of us understand that at this period of time in Japan's history, this early period of printmaking, the Japanese were very open to receiving influences from everywhere, and particularly from the West. And in some ways they had to, because all these influences were coming in all at once. As I said, imagine seeing Cubism for the first time on a Monday, and then seeing, symbolism and or impressionism, or Dadaism or whatever, all coming in all at once. I mean, it is quite astonishing, the time that they were living in. And so I think all of these artists had to really sort of, they had to go inward and in order to relate to all these artistic ideas, which were highly individualistic. And they had to sort of come to terms with themselves as individuals in Japanese society and connect themselves to what it might be, to the idea of being an artist. They had to open up their mind and their heart, to that. And so accepting these influences really enriched their life so that they can move forward and become artists, fully mature, independent, and showcasing and producing artwork that they were themselves proud of. And so all of the artwork we discussed today really pays tribute to those ideas and to the birth of the Japanese print artist as an artist. So when we think of Shinhanga prints, we're not really, focusing on the individual. We're focusing on the product, the print. And in these prints, and the prints of the Sosaku Hanga movement, even, and we could talk about this in terms of throughout the ages, and how they these artists were connecting to what was going on before the war, certainly during the war and after the war. But even at this period of time, the birth of the movement, they were really interested in connecting to something that was much larger than themselves, that was much larger than the country that they lived in, and incorporating these ideas into something that they can produce for themselves, so that they're basically sort of, putting together their internal world as an artist and making sense of everything. And I think they left a legacy of really striking, and important artwork that we can all be, very lucky to experience. So again, it's all of this is in service to that idea, and it's a pleasure to share it with all of you. So before I end my, part of this conversation, I'll open up the seminar to questions if you have any. I'll just kind of zoom in on these two prints so you can kind of see Onchi's printing. Of course, this is self-printed, and you'll see how the splashes of color, the inconsistencies in how it's printed. It's very expressive, very wild. Onchi is very well known to produce that. And for those of you interested in Onchi's work, I caution you. So when you're out in the marketplace interested in looking for Onchi's work, some of his later prints were produced by by publishers because they wanted to do something that was Onchi, involved, but Onchi really became kind of bored with producing multiples. And so you have to be careful that when you're buying an Onchi print, that it displays kind of a messy quality to it. If it looks too neat, it's probably not printed by him. So I just want to point that out. And there are not many eyes that are attuned to find those things. So you want to make sure you're working with a dealer who understands Onchi's work. So I'm going to just come in and again show you the, printing and quickly show the poster. Really neat. All right, and before we conclude and I take questions, I just wanted to show some books that would be helpful to all of you, if you want to learn more about this period of art. This exhibition catalog, Hanga Japanese Creative Prints, by it's a museum, in Australia. I forget the name of the museum. Gallery of New South Wales, I think, without like cracking the book open and looking carefully. But this book, you can find it. I have it, in my bookstore for sale. I highly recommend. A lot of the prints that you saw in this, lecture are illustrated and discussed in this book. Now, this is the latest catalog raisonné for Onchi. This was produced for a museum exhibition at MoMAT, or Museum of Modern Art, Tokyo. This book came out about 4 or 5 years ago. Very, very important book. I highly recommend it. I also have this book in my bookstore. This is a catalog raisonné for Yamamoto Kanai, and this is probably the best book on him. It shows all of his prints and all of the magazine designs that he produced, as well as some postcards and other things. And so this is probably the book to acquire. I also have this in my bookstore. This catalog is on Minami Kunzo, on his watercolors, oil paintings, and woodblock prints. And this book, is probably the best one on Tobari Kogan. It showcases all of his woodblock prints plus his sculptures. This is a bronze that he produced. He was quite gifted as an artist. And, so you will see all of the prints that we discussed, plus more. And of course, his watercolors, his oils, as well as his sculptures. So, that's quite a bit that we put together today. So let me bring in the comments. Sit down for a moment. So, well, hello everyone. I see everyone's popping up. Thanks for joining me. So, if you have any questions, I'm happy to address them now. Well, thank you, Lisa. Hi, Robert. Hi, Elizabeth. Hi, Tina. So I just wanted to say hello to everyone. Thank you for hanging out. We spent I think it was like an hour. We saw a lot of lovely prints. So thank you for staying with me. If you have any questions, feel free to jot them down. I'd be happy to address them now. And or I'm always happy to address questions in the comments below the video. And so for those of you who are not joining us live but are watching this at a later date, I do check those comments all the time. So if you're watching this video and it's 2023, I will be answering those questions in 2023. It happens to be March 20th, 2021. So yeah. Uh, Oh, okay. So Elizabeth or Liz, hi. You're asking a question of explain the process of embossing. So we saw embossing on that one print by Tobari Kogan, and there was on the kimono of the lady, it was embossed. And basically, embossing is pretty easy in the sense that you carve the block as you normally would. You wet the paper, but you impress the block into the paper without applying pigments. And the paper then absorbs the design, but not pigment. And so it creates kind of a subtle effect that gives texture, but there's no pigments. And so printmaking is it's catering to print connoisseurs. And one of the things that connoisseurs love is being able to hold the print in their hand and kind of examine it. And you also have to understand that a lot of these prints in this early period of time were produced to be viewed in candlelight. There wasn't electricity in before the 20s in most parts of Japan. And so a lot of the techniques that were produced, such as embossing, but you also get mica, silver mica or gold flakes in prints. Those effects were included in prints to give print connoisseurs sort of an intimate experience when they're reviewing prints. So it's kind of a neat thing. Of course, with electricity and with the lights that are being really bright, that washes those things out. And so anyway, that's why that those things are not as popular. I don't see embossing as often in prints in the 21st century. I mean, artists are more interested in doing different things with printing, but the embossing was something really popular in Edo period as well as early 20th century printmaking. So thanks for the question, Liz. Now, I need to say that my phone just told me of my 20%, and I charged my phone, but I guess like the way that I was using it today, and we've been online together for I think an hour, caused a lot of usage on my battery. So I want to thank all of you. I don't see any other questions. So feel free to ask any other questions as they appear. And if you rewatch this and you have comments, feel free to add those there. And of course, for those of you watching this video at a later date, feel free to add comments, questions, and I'll be happy to address them. So thank you for joining me on our conversation about the early period prints of the Sosaku Hanga movement. It's been a pleasure to share these works with you, and I look forward to doing more of these seminars in the future. I'll be doing them quarterly, so expect another one. And if there's a topic that you'd like to see me address, I'd be happy to hear that. Feel free to leave suggestions. So it's great to be able to present this to all of you on spring, the first day of spring. So this is a good way to get our spring started. And also, I'm doing this in commemoration for Asia Week. So it's Asia Week in New York. And there's all of these activities happening online. So if you're online and you want to learn more about Japanese prints, there's a lot of things going on. So have a look. Of course, the world's really interesting now that we could connect online and do these things for everyone together. So, oh, Robert just asked a question: framing and matting issues. Well, quickly, because my phone probably will die out. One should always frame prints with archival materials. That should go without saying. I recommend using reputable framers. Don't go to the 2 or 3 hour frame shops for important artwork. Do not do that. It's okay to frame a newspaper or a magazine from those frame shops, okay, but not fine art, particularly Japanese prints that are fragile. So all archival materials using hinges that are made from archival paper and Japanese rice paste to attach the prints to the hinges. And I would use UV glass, museum glass, and I would swap out the museum glass every 8 to 10 years. So put a date on the back of your frame because the technology of the glass changes about every 8 to 10 years, and so what you put a date on when the print you have is framed, and by the time you get to 8 to 10 years, you want to swap that out and get a new frame. Not a new frame, a new glass, and they're not that expensive. So every 8 to 10 years, that ensures the quality of the UV protection. Yeah, Robert, you asked should you float it? Yeah, that's a personal choice. You could float a print, or you can mat it and covering up part of the print. I personally prefer floating because I like to see all of the edges of the paper. So that's my quick take. But anyway, so that we're not cut off abruptly, again, I want to thank all of you for joining me. And feel free to go to my website. I have a lot of information there. I have a lot of books, of course, a lot of prints for sale. And reach out to me if you have any questions or if I can be of further assistance. Thank you again for joining me. I'm Elias Martin of Collecting Japanese Prints. I look forward to seeing you in the near future. Thank you.